Welcome back to the Tales from Newgate, where I explore the lives and crimes of those who were resident at the infamous Newgate Prison. In the last episode, I told you the story of Jonathan Wild's early life and how his ventures into organising the criminal underground of London began. In this episode, I want to explain how he became an official thief-taker and how his system worked and where the origins of that system came from. So, please get comfortable and come with me back in time to London in the early 1700s and the criminal underbelly that was positively thriving due to the chaotic nature of the judicial system. We left Jonathan Wild at the end of the last episode looking for a way to make a lot of money, but without the risk of being arrested, and that he'd begun to formulate a plan. Wild had been released from the Wood Street Compter, where he'd been held for debt, and after living with Mary Milliner, now known as Mrs. Mary Wild, in a brothel off of Drury Lane, Wild and Mary moved to one of the Cock Alleys, further east and nearer to where he'd probably lived before his incarceration. There were many reasons why Wild decided to move from Lutyens Lane to one of the Cock Alleys. One reason, as mentioned in the last episode, was because he didn't like the risk of living in a brothel. But there are a number of other reasons for Mary and Jonathan Wild to leave that infamous street and move. He had apparently overplayed his hand with a member of the local street gang, and in response, that man decided to shoot at Wild as he left the brothel one day. Something that I'm sure scared the living daylights out of Wild. Another reason for him moving was probably the real reason, and that was because Cock Alley was closer to Old Street, and at the time, Old Street was renowned for its coiners. Coiners were those who illegally counterfeited coins. They would chip tiny pieces off the gold and silver coins that were in circulation and from whole coins that were brought to them by pickpockets. They would then make their own coins once they had collected enough to mix with far less valuable metals. You may have seen in films when a person would bite on a coin before accepting it as payment. This was to ensure that the coin was real and held the correct amount of precious metal in it. There were suggestions that when Wild first arrived in London for the second time, accompanied perhaps by the Lady Doctor, they had already begun to hang around with the lesser honest members of society. And of course, as he was a trained metal worker, forgery was an obvious way of making a living. It is said that he was friendly with a large family of coiners who lived and worked on Old Street, and so moving to this area would have made their management easier. And yes, I said management, as already Wild was beginning to see himself as a manager of crime, not a committer of it. And of course, if Wild had frequented this area before he was committed to Wood Street Compter, then he would have been more at ease there, surrounded by familiar people and places, especially if there was a violent man around who wanted to kill him. There was, however, perhaps one more reason why Wild chose this area to move to, and that was to be nearer to a man called Charles Hitchin, a man that will have probably the greatest influence on Wild's life. Now, Wild had learned a great deal whilst at the Wood Street Compter, not only about how the judicial system was run, but about how the criminals worked, and it was believed that whilst there, Wilde would have met Hitchin, who was the under-marshal of the City of London, and although not responsible for the running of the debtors' prison, he would have been a frequent visitor, as he would have used this prison as a temporary holding place for those who were arrested. Charles Hitchin's beginnings were very similar to those of Wilde's. He was also born in Wolverhampton in around 1675 and was apprenticed and then became a cabinet maker. His life may have gone unnoticed by the history books if it wasn't for a young lady called Elizabeth Wells. Now, Elizabeth lived in King's Walden in Hertfordshire, and her father, John Wells, although by the sounds of it not a wealthy man, he was a man of very modest means. Elizabeth and Hitchin married in Staffordshire in 1703, in the same year that Wilde became a father for the first time, having married in Wolverhampton the year before. Shortly after they were married, Charles and Elizabeth Hitchin moved to London. Now, it isn't clear what Hitchin did for a living, although all indications show that, like Wilde, he got in with a bad crowd and, like Wilde, upon arriving in London, he set about learning the craft of thieving and may have taken up a supporting role to bolster his income, whilst perhaps continuing to be a cabinet maker as well. In 1711, Elizabeth's father died and she inherited half of his assets, with the other half going to her sister. Charles Hitchin took advantage of this sudden windfall and attended an auction in January of 1712, where he was the successful bidder for the position of under-marshal to the City of London, a position that cost him a staggering £700. At first glance, it seems to be an odd position to buy. After all, wasn't he a simple cabinet maker? Well, it was suggested that before he received this windfall, he had been struggling, and it's likely that he may have become embroiled in the handling and receiving of stolen goods as a way to pay his way, and he was very well aware of all the so-called benefits that being an under-marshal brought with it. So, although he may have looked the part of a respectable gentleman, he was far from it. Now, just for context, as a skilled tradesman, Hitchin could expect to earn around £30 a year, and with that and the money that a wife was able to earn, an average-sized family would be able to stay housed, clothed and fed for a year, but only just. As the under-marshal of the City of London, Hitchin was furnished with a salary of £60 per annum, and there were other expenses that he could claim reimbursement for. An allowance for clothes and a horse, £5 annually for good service, about £30 for selling a freedom of the city, and a share from each prisoner's entrance fee to the prisons and watchhouses. And he had 3 men working for him that he paid £1 a day to. He also had the official power of arrest and the right to issue warrants, so this position came with quite a bit of power. Before I go into the very interesting relationship between Wilde and Hitchin, it's probably worth spending a couple of moments to explain quite how the criminal justice system worked. As previously mentioned, in 1712 there was no police force, and very simply, or rather not, everyone who lived in London were responsible for law enforcement. In fact, they were legally obliged to get involved if they saw a crime being committed. And if they heard the hue and cry, they were required to join in the chase for the criminal. There were a number of sectors of management of the City of London who had responsibility for actually arresting suspects and detaining them. Firstly, there was the City Marshal, who reported to the Lord Mayor and the Aldermen of London. He had an under-marshal, and between them they managed 6 men. Alongside the Mayor's team, there was also a group that reported to the Justice of the Peace, and those were the constables and the night watchmen. And as for the beadles, well, they just reported to everybody and no one, it seems. As previously mentioned, in 1712 there was no police force. The whole way that the policing of London worked was chaotic. Roles and responsibilities were poorly defined, and there was an awful lot of overlap. With one role, well, no one actually knew what they did. With the cost of buying the position being so high, naturally these marshals looked for other ways to bolster their income, and Hitchin was no different. And he was famously quoted as saying, "Well, what do you think I bought my place for, but to make the most of it?" And to be honest, in those days, that was probably not as shocking as it is now. Since the late 1600s, incentives have been offered for the apprehension and conviction of criminals, But by the 1700s, this had become an established norm, and these rewards had grown rapidly in line with the growth in crime in London at the time, and crime in London at the time was out of control. A thief-taker would typically receive £1 for every criminal they arrested and convicted. For more serious crimes, such as highway robbery, a thief-taker could be paid up to £40 for their efforts, so arresting people was a very lucrative business. As the Under-Marshal of the City of London, Hitchin, although not responsible for the running of the debtors' prison, as these compters often held thieves that had been apprehended overnight and were awaiting an appearance in court, Hitchin would have been a frequent visitor to the Wood Street Compter, and it's thought that this is when Wilde and Hitchin first met, when Wilde was working for the jailers, collecting those arrested by the watchman and then taken to court for the formal indictments the morning after. It isn't known what made Wilde stand out to Hitchin, but maybe their shared northern accent was all that was needed. Whilst in the Compter, Wilde probably worked with Hitchin and his men, and as he was obviously not only an intelligent man, but a ruthless and sometimes heartless one, Hitchin probably saw him in action and was impressed. But what probably made Wilde so attractive to Hitchin was his ability to converse with beggars and officials all at their level, and being able to read and write was a real bonus. I think Hitchin would have probably employed Wilde when he was first released from the Compter in December of 1712, but at that time, Hitchin was in a little bit of bother. Hitchin was obviously a reasonably intelligent man, and by the time he bought the role of Under-Marshal, he seems to have had a great deal of knowledge of the way that the criminal system worked. And he also had a lot of contacts, so it sounds as though from the minute he took his position, he began to exploit it. And to say that he hit the ground running, well, that was probably an understatement. He apparently sent out his men on the very first day of his appointment to visit with every alehouse, gin house, tavern and coffee house to inform them of his position and what Hitchin expected of these people. And he gave them a stern warning of what would happen if they didn't obey him and his men. Hitchin and his men would also visit the prisons, meet with those who had been caught the day before and negotiate or bully them into giving up the location of their booty, and in return they were promised either their release from prison or their acquittal at trial. Often these promises were not kept, and he was very quickly known as someone whose word meant nothing, and his name very quickly became one that was said with resentment. The way that Hitchin performed his role as the Under-Marshal was as follows. He would brief his men to go out and find out from their people what they had managed to acquire the previous day. He would then search the papers for advertisements from gentlemen and some ladies who had been robbed either from their homes or whilst out in London, and were offering a reward for the return of these goods. Hitchin would then find out from his 3 assistants where the said goods were being held and visit with the thief. The goods that were considered the most valuable to the victim were seized by Hitchin's team, and only those items considered without real value, a coat maybe, or a pair of old shoes, would be left for the thief to dispose of as they saw fit. Often, if the thief complained, promises of a share in the reward were made once the transactions had been completed. However, these promises were often forgotten by Hitchin, and some were never honoured at all. After collecting the valuable items from the thieves, Hitchin would contact the owners of these items via letter and negotiate a reward for the goods' return. If the victim refused to pay, then and only if the items held personally damaging information, such as a letter to a mistress or the victim's location when the items were stolen, say a brothel, while Hitchin would subtly threaten to expose them, and usually a deal was struck. And for the goods that an owner was not prepared to pay well over the odds for, well, Hitchin would simply organise their resale via a pawn shop or known fence. And if the thief grumbled about giving up most of his booty to the marshal and his men, well, Hitchin would remind them of his power and ability to have them arrested, and again, a deal was usually agreed upon. His influence grew quickly, as well as the resentment from those that he dealt with, and as I've said before, he was not a subtle man. However, Hitchin got by, and he didn't seem to think that anyone would question his actions, as so many before him had done similar. Sadly, as with most things that Hitchin did, he overplayed his hand. He brazenly went about his business in public and generally considered himself invincible. Subtlety was not something that Hitchin really understood, from his tall and gangly appearance to his flamboyant clothes, long wig and gold-hilted sword that he displayed for all to see. So within months of him taking up his position, it became clear to those in charge that this was not a man that should be an under-marshal, and in Gerald Housen's book we get a glimpse into not only what the trouble with Hitchin was, but also how he spent his time. If I quickly run through Hitchin's daily routine, the extent of his exploitation of the role of under-marshal is plain to see. Hitchin's day began by spending his morning at Hatton's in Basinghall, where he read the Daily Courant and other newspapers from notices of lost, stolen and misplaced property. He then would visit one of the many number of coffee houses and inns on his patch. You see, in those days, business wasn't done in an office or a boardroom, but in the many inns, taverns, public houses and coffee houses across the country. And it appears that Hitchin had many places of business that he worked out of. He was known to write his blackmail letters from the Woolpack Inn in Foster Lane. He was always seen at lunch at the King's Head on Ivy Lane, where the landlord was believed to be a receiver of stolen goods, as was the proprietor of the King's Head in Paternoster Road, where he was also a frequent visitor. He was also believed to be a regular visitor to Macy's Coffee House in Old Change, and he was probably most often seen at Mears in St Paul's House Court, as it was near to where he lived. In one report written by the alderman at the time, he was seen at the Three Tuns and the Black Horse in Moorfield, in the company of notorious thieves. The alderman went on to write that Hitchin would go there every night to hand out the rewards from the day to those that were involved. It's interesting that the alderman mentions these two pubs and the area of Moorfield in his report. You see, Moorfield at the time was also well known for its mollies and molly houses. Molly houses were enclosed private spaces gathering individuals who wanted to socialise and seek pleasure with partners of the same sex. Homosexuality was a criminal offence in the 1700s, and Hitchin was known to be homosexual. And as with everything he didn't really hide the fact. It's likely that his marriage to Elizabeth Wells was actually a front, although they did have one child, a girl, who was christened at St Augustine's with St Faith on Watling Street on the 26th of October 1709, having been born on the 19th. So although there was no disputing his sexual orientation, the marriage must have been, at the very least, consummated. And it's also generally known that he would visit the Quaker workhouse in Clerkenwell to meet with a gang of pickpockets that he had recruited. Hitchin affectionately called these small boys the mathematicians, and he was known to control them with fear, and also he used his position to maintain these children's freedom when necessary. Between August of 1712 and late June of 1713, a committee reviewed the evidence that had been brought to them, and all decided that Hitchin needed to be stopped. But they knew that finding a new under-marshal, someone who would be willing to pay the £700 purchase price, would be incredibly difficult, and if they replaced Hitchin so soon after he became the under-marshal, well, it had caused quite a lot of embarrassment. So instead they decided to allow Hitchin to remain the under-marshal in name only. But of course he was still allowed to perform the role of the thief-taker, and he still had the power of arrest and the power to obtain warrants, but he lost his paid men. So by the summer of 1713, Hitchin was in need of help, and this was when he approached Wilde, shortly after Wilde had moved to the gin house on Cock Alley and was beginning to develop his own ways to exploit those around him, using similar tactics to those used by Hitchin. Wilde didn't particularly want to work for someone, but he saw the advantages of working for the under-marshal, the increased power this would give him, as well as a way to expand his income a little. But he didn't much like the idea of being paid a shilling a day for his time. But he knew that he would be receiving bonuses and shares in rewards, so there was an obvious financial advantage. But Wilde also either knew or suspected Hitchin of being gay, and as he was beginning to learn, that sort of knowledge can be very, very useful at times. So Wilde began to work for Hitchin, and to begin with, they got on well. Hitchin, not being one for a scrap, would send Wilde in to sort out the unruly housebreakers or to threaten and beat a pickpocket for not declaring everything they had stolen that day. He would visit the prisoners in the various prisons in London, showing kindness to the captives whilst extracting information from them. He would arrest those that had become a problem to Hitchin and beat up others who didn't toe the line. And of course, he would meet with the gangs that worked with Hitchin and distribute to them their payoffs for information, cooperation and assistance in the matters that happened that day. To Wilde, this was no different to what he had been doing in the latter months at the confinement at Wood Street, but now he had free range and was broadening his circle of associates by the day. I came across a number of stories about Wilde's time with Hitchin, and there was a story that was told in a pamphlet published in 1718 and written by Wilde himself. It was in response to a pamphlet Hitchin had written, complaining about how the other thief-takers behaved and why they should not be trusted. Wilde had left Hitchin by then and had set himself up in direct competition to Hitchin, and they argued with each other via these formal printed pamphlets. This published pamphlet tells the story of one night when Hitchin and Wilde came across a group of young pickpockets who were known to the under-marshal. This small group of boys, upon seeing Hitchin approaching, they scarpered. Wilde asked Hitchin why they'd fled, and Hitchin explains that they should have met with him that morning for him to collect a pocketbook that he'd instructed them to steal the previous day. They fled because they knew that they were in trouble and that Hitchin would arrest them for their disobedience. One of them was a boy called Jack Jones, and Hitchin and Wilde caught this boy as he hid behind a coach. They dragged him to a tavern and probably roughed him up a little and threatened him with all sorts, including a visit to Newgate and the hangman. Hitchin went on to say that he knew that Jones and 3 other boys had committed a house robbery. Jack Jones, probably not being older than about 12, instantly caved and confessed to everything and was taken to the nearest compter for holding until the next morning. At that court appearance, the Justice of the Peace, who questioned the child, issued warrants for the arrest of Jones's accomplices. Hitchin was quickly informed where the other boys were hiding, and he and Wilde arranged to visit the address that evening to apprehend these children. Shortly after sunset, Hitchin and Wilde went to the address that they were given and crept up to the front door and quietly opened it. They could hear voices coming from the room at the back, so they headed to the closed door, burst it open expecting to see a group of children, but were met by the force of at least 8 or 9 boys and men who were pretty cheesed off that they'd just been burst in on. This was not what they'd expected, and Hitchin, seeing the immediate danger to his life, retreated rapidly, leaving Wilde alone to handle things. After Hitchin had gained his composure, had taken a few deep breaths and straightened his wig, he headed off down the road in search of a watchman or constable. A short while later, Hitchin returned with 8 to 10 watchmen, as well as a constable to back him up. He'd obviously exaggerated the extent of the threat those within that room posed, as no one seemed eager to be the first to enter. Eventually, the constable took the leading role, as was the custom, and charged into the room with his staff outstretched. Hitchin was following him and shouting, "Where are the rebel villains? Why don't you secure them?" Well, when they finally became aware of the room and its contents, all they could see was Wilde leaning against a wall looking, to be honest, a little bored. And there was no one else there. The room appeared completely empty until Wilde pointed to the table that was on the other side of the room and stated that 2 of the boys were hiding under that table. So the constable and Hitchin grabbed a child each and took them to Newgate Prison. However, after a short time at Newgate, they were both moved to Marshalsea Prison, as the crime was actually committed in Surrey and therefore didn't fall under the purview of the City of London and the Under-Marshal. At the next court sessions in Surrey that was held in Kingston, their trial commenced with Jack Jones giving evidence against his 2 companions. I don't have access to the court transcript or any information other than this account, but I suspect Hitchin would have given evidence, along with the owner of the house that was broken into, as well as the constable who assisted in the arrest. Hitchin fully endorsed these boys' conviction, one that would have seen them both hang. Well, Hitchin probably banked upon these boys being just 2 of the many children that lived on the streets and had no family to protect them, but he was wrong. as at the trial both sets of parents attended, and then they gave evidence not to convince the jury that their children were innocent, but to firmly point the finger at Hitchin as being the reason why they'd committed the crimes in the first place. They went on to explain how the children had been enticed into committing crimes and were threatened or beaten if they refused to comply. Well, if Hitchin's bad name hadn't been well known in Surrey after this court case, it certainly was, and it does show how transparent Hitchin was with his dealings, and that these dealings were known to a great many people, including the judge, who after some discussion actually recommended to the jury that they should find these two boys innocent, and he even suggested that perhaps the motive of the prosecution by the under-marshal was driven more by a desire to earn £40 each from these boys' heads than actually having proof that they were responsible. So within minutes of the jury being told to deliberate, something they did in the courtroom for all to see and perhaps hear, they took the judge's advice and acquitted the children, who went home later that evening with their parents. It was said that Hitchin was so outraged and insulted by the judge that he flounced out of the courtroom and went straight back to the City of London, where he probably sulked for a while. Wilde stayed behind to complete the necessary paperwork before following Hitchin back to London under his own steam. That story, although written with immense bias, I should imagine, explains how Hitchin did business, openly exploiting those that he considered beneath him, and he became hated by most of the working people of London. In fact, Hitchin's ability to antagonise people was really quite outstanding, and he really did see himself as a cut above the rest. This is shown clearly in a story that was told in Housen's book and tells the story of an incident that happened one night, probably in the early spring of 1714. Hitchin saw a well-dressed woman walking down the street in front of him and Wilde one evening. Hitchin told Wilde that the woman was well known to be lewd. Hitchin decided to show his power by approaching the woman and demanding that she told him her name. The lady replied that she was the wife of a bailiff, to which Hitchin loudly scoffed that she was more likely a whore, and arrested her, telling her that she was going to go to the Compter until she met with the judge the following day. Now, Hitchin didn't take her to the Compter. Instead, he took her to one of his favourite dining places and made her sit in the corner of the room, well away from the fire, shivering, and she was sobbing silently to herself. Hitchin, however, sat directly in front of the heat and ate a hearty meal, which he washed down with a particularly good glass of wine. As he wiped his face and burped loudly, he suggested to the lady that really, if she wanted to stay free, it would perhaps be beneficial if she were to pay for his dinner. He reminded her that he was the marshal, and that she'd obviously been informed upon, and her behaviour was known to him, and he suggested that if she were to pay for his dinner, then obviously she would be under his protection from any similar arrest ever happening again. Well, the lady now saw what was going on and became a little cross, but she decided to pay the bill and returned home to her husband, furious. And that's an example of exactly how Hitchin managed to make enemies. As simple as that. Now, it is highly likely that Hitchin was well aware of who this woman was. Maybe there was rumours of infidelity that triggered this event, but to be honest, I suspect it was more a flex. He showed off to Wilde that he had this power that could make people do whatever he wanted them to. And maybe that particular bailiff, who she was the wife of, wasn't playing ball with Hitchin, or perhaps owed Hitchin money. You see, Hitchin was also known to be vain and a petty man, and very vindictive, and I've read more than one report where he used his power of arrest to punish those who defied or even ridiculed his position. And when it came to the molly houses, if you turned down his affections, you were likely to be arrested too. So I think this story really does exemplify the arrogance and clumsiness of his approach to, well, pretty much everything that he came across. And in fact, even clergymen were not safe, as he accused one clergyman of engaging with a prostitute, simply because he'd popped down the alley to relieve himself. The relationship between Wilde and Hitchin soured quickly, with Wilde already showing signs of venturing out on his own as early as 1714. But the full battle these two men engaged in doesn't truly begin until 1718, when Hitchin and Wilde begin a war of pamphlets, spilling the beans on each other's ventures and generally committing numerous counts of libel. However, that's a story for another episode, and in the next episode I will run through a few of the crimes and criminal activities that Wilde began to engage in, from mass theft, from royalty at a reception, to houses being stripped of everything, including the floorboards. The imagination of this man and his ability to actually organise the criminals is, well, really quite impressive, and these days he would have likely risen to the position of CEO of a large corporation. But then, with the huge divide between the rich and the poor, Wilde chose to become the CEO of London crime. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode when I continue telling you the tales from Newgate and the story of Wilde's ventures, including the origins of the double cross.